Research Institute, one of the co-sponsors of this event, along with the Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU. So to begin the program, I'm happy to introduce the Executive Director of the School of International Public Affairs, Dr. John Stepp.
Thanks, Jorge. Welcome everybody. This is an exciting day at FIU, but every conference that Jorge Duani does is an exciting one at FIU, given our interest, the faculty expertise, and our vision. The School of International and Public Affairs is comprised of 8 departments: Politics and International Relations, Global and Sociocultural Studies, History, Economics, Public Administration, Criminal Justice, and Religious Studies. In addition, we have 18 institutes, programs, centers, and initiatives that we're building. Our advantage is that we're a young university, which means we're nimble. We haven't calcified, and the School of International and Public Affairs is an example of that. And I have to tell you of my 2 most recent appointments, my 2 most important appointments since I became director of SIPA were Jorge Duani and Frank Mora, who's director of LAC. So I invite you to see our campus. We have a fabulous Cuban collection of 100 years of Cuban art next door in the Frost, which is a gift of Jorge and Darlene Perez to benefit the Cuban Research Institute. Professor Duani has revitalized Cuban studies here, and I expect that this conference will be another smashing success. So I'm just delighted to welcome you to the school and to FIU. Welcome everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you, John, and thank you for your support of everything we do here. Now I'd like to ask Dr. Rebecca May Salakar, who is the Chair of the Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU and the co-sponsor of this event, to address you.
Thank you, Jorge. It's a great pleasure to welcome our visitors to FIU and to an event co-sponsored by the Department of Politics and International Relations. It's also a pleasure to see all the students who were bribed, enticed, and otherwise forced to come. I know you're here because you have been coerced, but let me suggest something to you. You have a great opportunity today to ask questions. Don't let them get away with what they say, okay? Think about what they're suggesting. Ask them questions. Who knows, you might find a dissertation here and decide that you want to go on and do a doctorate in political science or international relations. I'm probably one of the few people in the room here today that remembers Miami before 1960. It's a vague memory, it was a very small memory, but it was a memory. Tamiami Trail, which is Southwest 8th Street, wasn't called Calle Ocho. It was, in fact, Tamiami Trail. It went from Tampa to Miami, and that's what it was about. Miami is a great place today, and it's a great place because, in fact, we have such a vibrant, multi-ethnic, diverse community. One of the things that our department is doing and is working hard to do is to understand our community and the various communities within it much better. So today you'll see some of my colleagues here who are doing some really great work. I thank them for their participation, and I thank you for attending. Have a great conference.
Thank you, Becky. At some point, I think we exchanged emails and we realized that almost half of the Department of Politics and International Relations is participating here, and we're very happy to collaborate with the department. Let me just say a few words as a way of introduction to the topic, and then I'll immediately pass the floor on to the first panel. For several years, as many of you may know, scholars have talked about the demographic and political transitions of the Cuban population in the United States, especially here in South Florida. According to some authors, including some who are here today, the rise of a new generation of U.S.-born Cubans, together with a changing profile of a more recent Cuban diaspora since the 1990s, would provoke the end of exile, as we now know it in its conventional sense. Certainly by the year 2010, 42% of all 1.8 million people of Cuban origin in the U.S. have been born here, so it's the second generation that's now taking over in demographic terms. And if you look at those who were born in Cuba, slightly more than half of those who are now living here had arrived after 1990. Those are two important facts that I think we should take into account when discussing the Cuban American vote today. The displacement of the first by the second generation of immigrants, according to this literature, would entail a change in mentality among Cuban Americans, which would approximate them ideologically to other ethnic minorities in the United States, especially Latinos, such as Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans. This change would be reflected, according to this prediction, in a growing affiliation to the Democratic Party in the United States, and it would also imply an effort to normalize relations between Cuban immigrants and their sending country. Such relations are technically known as transnational and diasporic in other historical and contemporary contexts. So the main question, I think, at this point, and for us here today, is how and to what extent this demographic and political transformation has taken place, and we hope to answer at least part of those questions during our symposium. Another key issue is whether the new generation of Cuban Americans are reproducing the ideology of their parents or actually distancing themselves from the prevailing currents. It is also worthwhile examining if Cubans living in the U.S. are converging with prevailing ideological orientations prevalent among other Latino groups that I mentioned before. Several public polls conducted by various entities, including some that are represented in this symposium, allow us to approach these questions based on empirical data. In November 2012, a large proportion of Cuban Americans voted for President Barack Obama. We don't know exactly what proportion of that number of voters because they differ from one poll to another. Some of the findings of these polls were inconsistent with one another, depending on their methodology, particularly their sampling frames. Yet most experts agree that Cuban Americans have substantially shifted their electoral preferences over time, with an increasing proportion favoring the presidential candidates of the Democratic Party. And yet at the same time, most polls show that the majority of Cuban Americans still identify with the Republican Party. So the main purpose of this meeting is to examine the changes as well as the continuities in Cuban American voting patterns. Even though it seems premature to proclaim the so-called end of exile, the recent demographic and political transformations of Cuban Americans that I just sketched before have accelerated what you might call the Latinization of Cubans in the U.S. So to address this and other related topics, we're very fortunate to have gathered a stellar cast at FIU, as well as guest scholars and pollsters. Some of you have traveled from Boston, from New York, Washington, Berkeley, and maybe even Coral Gables, and we thank you all for accepting our invitation. So without further ado, we'll begin with the first panel. I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Astrid Araras.
Good morning. Thank you for coming today. I'm delighted to be here to see all my students who work course. So they're getting brownie points and free breakfast, so I'm sure they're not complaining about being here so early in the morning. I'm delighted to chair this panel today. I have very distinguished professors, academics here next to me. And I propose that we have a 15-minute presentation. I will be sending 13 short napkins pieces here with the minutes that you have left. And why don't we start with our guest who's coming from outside of Miami. His name is Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez from the Pew Hispanic Center.
Great, thank you. And I should present up there. Good morning, it's a real pleasure to be here. Let me get my presentation loaded here.
Wait, you're waiting here talking.
Wait, I don't know. Okay, go back.
Be careful.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk today about some of the work of the Pew Research Center with regards to a national perspective on the nation's Cuban American community and partisanship among Cuban American community. We've been doing polling for quite some time at the Pew Research Center on the Latino community. And in a few of the years that we've had polling, we've done enough of a large enough sample size or designed specifically to be able to say something about the various communities within the Latino population. So I want to talk about some of those numbers. But before I do that, one other thing I want to note is that it's actually quite hard to find good data on measuring partisanship or even just the general public opinion attitudes of the nation's Cuban American community. And to give you an example of that, if you take a look at the work that we've done over the last 10 years at Pew Research, for 10, 12 years, we have been conducting an annual survey. However, only in 4 of those years is there a sufficient sample size or a survey that was designed specifically to measure the opinions of the various Hispanic demographic country of origin groups. And so I'm going to show you some results from that. But first, let me start by talking about sort of the big picture. As you know, the voter turnout rates for the nation's Latino population have generally been on the order of about 50%. In 2012, 48% of Latinos who were eligible to vote turned out to vote according to an analysis of the current population survey. It's important to note that these are people who are self-reporting that they voted. So this is people who were asked, did you vote in the last election? And this gives you some sense of that. Despite that, you can see how big of a difference there is between Latinos and whites and blacks, and perhaps the big story of 2012 and also perhaps 2008 was that African American voter turnout surpassed white turnout for the first time. So some very interesting differences across groups. But what does this look like within the Latino community? So taking a look within the Latino community over the last few presidential election cycles, you can see that Cuban Americans generally far surpass their non-Cuban counterparts within the Latino population in terms of voter turnout rates. In fact, these voter turnout rates match those, if you take a look back at the previous slide, those of whites and blacks for the most part in terms of voter turnout. So Cuban Americans, as I'm sure this audience is very familiar with, are among the most engaged in terms of voting in election cycles overall. Now, when we take a look at Pew Hispanic Center surveys, and we ask the question about political party identification, what's happened over the years and what have we seen in our survey data? So I'm showing you numbers from 2002, 2006, 2012, and 2013. All of these are surveys that were designed to measure the opinions of various demographic subgroups of the Latino community by country of origin. As you can see in 2002, among Cuban registered voters, 54% said that they identified with the Republican Party. That number fell to 50% in 2006, 31% in 2012, and 34% in 2013. I wish I had a little bit more data for that 2008 period, because I think that that was an important period where not just for Cuban Americans do you see this shift towards identifying as a Democrat, but it was part of a national trend as well. There was a lot of movement towards the Democratic Party across a number of subgroups, not just among Latinos. Now, you can look at this in a different way, and this is a different measure here. This is taking those independents and asking them the question, do you lean more towards one party or the other? And combining those two questions, here are the results you get. A very similar pattern of the declining share of Cuban American registered voters who identify with or lean towards the Republican Party, and the Democratic numbers are on the rise. But as you can see for 2012 and 2013, much closer numbers. Now, while I don't have the results here to share with you because the sample sizes were too small, in 2012 we also did ask Cuban Americans and our entire sample of Latinos, who are you going to vote for in the upcoming presidential election? Because all of these surveys were done either before an election or done in a non-election year. Well, in 2012, among Cuban Americans, about half, 47%, said that they were going to vote for Barack Obama, and about half, 46%, said that they were going to vote for Mitt Romney. So it looked from our data that there was a split in the vote. However, it's important to note that as you take a look at the sample size was small, and I don't know what conclusions we can quite draw from that for these particular point estimates, but it's important to note that we had noted at that time in our survey that there was a split, at least in the Cuban American vote. This fits with another story, which is the evangelical vote among Latinos. In 2012, our analysis of our survey in 2012 suggested that even among evangelicals who were largely voting Republican in prior election cycles, they too were split in their support for the two presidential candidates in 2012. So there were a few things happening, I think, at the same time. I want to talk about a few other facts just to put this a little bit in perspective. First, I want to talk about the ethnic composition of the Latino population. The Cuban American population is one of the larger Hispanic origin groups in the country. There are about 2 million people who say they're of Cuban origin in the country. Now, the reason why I have Salvadoran highlighted is that we've actually been having this interesting story in recent years where the Salvadoran population is on the verge of being number 3. And to give you some sense of that, you could see how some of these demographics are changing here. This is the growth in the two populations since 2006. The Census Bureau notes that there is no statistical difference between these two